There is a particular cruelty in the swiftness with which fate can unmake a life, in the way a single dawn can rise upon complete happiness and set upon utter ruin. And Lady Eleanora Ashworth learned this truth at the tender age of 19, when she watched her world shatter like fine porcelain dropped upon unforgiving marble. She had been, in those golden days before the fall, the cherished only daughter of the Earl of Whitmore, a girl blessed with honey-coloured hair that caught the candlelight like spun silk, eyes the deep blue of twilight skies, and a mind sharp enough to match wits with her father's most learned friends. Her mother had often remarked that Eleanora possessed a rare combination of beauty and intelligence, the sort of woman who could command a ballroom with her grace and a library with her discourse in equal measure. She had made her debut that spring to considerable success, dancing until dawn, fielding proposals from eager young lords, believing with the innocent certainty of the fortunate that her life would unfold in an endless procession of such delights. Then came the accusations. Treason, they whispered at first, then shouted from every gazette and drawing-room in London. The Earl of Whitmore, they claimed, had sold secrets to England's enemies, had betrayed his sovereign and his country for foreign gold. The evidence appeared damning letters in her father's hand, testimony from men she had never seen, documents bearing seals that seemed irrefutable. Her father protested his innocence until the very end, his voice hoarse and desperate as they dragged him from their home, as they stripped him of title and lands and honor, as they cast him into the damp darkness of prison, where he would draw his final breath, not 3 months later, broken not by guilt, but by the weight of lies he could not disprove. Her mother followed him into death within the fortnight, her heart simply stopping as though it could not bear to beat in a world so cruel, and Eleanora found herself standing in the wreckage of everything she had known, with nothing but the clothes upon her back and a name that had become a curse upon the lips of society. Those who had once clamoured for her attention now crossed streets to avoid her. Doors that had swung wide in welcome slammed shut at her approach. She was Lady Eleanora no longer, but merely the traitor's daughter, a pariah, a ghost haunting the edges of a world that had cast her out without mercy or remorse. Yet there burned within her breast a flame that circumstance could not extinguish, a quiet strength that her father had always admired and her mother had nurtured with careful wisdom. She would not lie down and perish as society expected. She would survive. And so Lady Eleanora Ashworth ceased to exist, and in her place rose Eleanor Vance, a governess of modest background and excellent references, forged by her own desperate hand, seeking employment far from London's cruel memory. When she read the advertisement for a position at Thornwood Manor, country estate of the Duke of Blackwood, some 3 days' journey from anyone who might recognize her face, she penned her application with steady fingers and a heart full of terrified hope. The letter of acceptance arrived within the week, and Eleanor Vance prepared to disappear into her new life, burying Lady Eleanora in the same grave that held her parents, never imagining that salvation might wear the face of the formidable Duke whose roof would shelter her secrets. Thornwood Manor rose from the mist of the Yorkshire moors like a slumbering giant of grey stone and ancient ambition, its towers piercing the leaden sky with the same unyielding authority that had marked the Fairfax family for generations beyond counting. Eleanor pressed her face closer to the rain-streaked window of the hired carriage, her breath fogging the glass as she beheld what would become her sanctuary or her prison, she could not yet tell which. The estate sprawled across the landscape with magnificent indifference to the humble village that crouched at its borders, its countless windows glinting like watchful eyes, its grounds stretching toward distant woodlands that seemed to swallow the very horizon. She had expected grandeur, for the Duke of Blackwood's wealth was legendary even among the peerage, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer imposing weight of the place, the way it seemed to press down upon her chest and whisper that she did not belong within its hallowed walls. The carriage deposited her at the servants' entrance, a pointed reminder of her new station that she accepted with quiet dignity, and within moments she found herself standing in a vast kitchen that hummed with the efficient activity of a household preparing for the master's return from London. It was there that she first encountered Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, a woman of perhaps 50 years whose steel-grey hair was pulled back with military precision and whose sharp eyes seemed to catalogue every thread of Eleanor's modest travelling dress. "You'll be the new governess then, Mrs. Hartley said, her tone neither warm nor cold but rather carefully measured, as though she had learned long ago not to invest emotion in those who might not last the month. Eleanor learned much in those first hours, guided through endless corridors and up winding staircases, while Mrs. Hartley dispensed information with the efficiency of a general briefing troops before battle. The Duke, she was told, demanded absolute perfection in all things and suffered neither fools nor excuses. He had raised his orphaned niece since the child was but 4 years old, when his sister had perished in a carriage accident alongside her wastrel husband, and though he provided everything Lady Charlotte could require, he remained distant, cold, a figure of authority rather than affection. 3 governesses had preceded Eleanor in the past 2 years alone, each departing in tears after failing to meet standards that seemed impossibly high. "The child is not difficult," Mrs. Hartley admitted as they paused before what would be Eleanor's modest chamber, "but she is lonely, and loneliness makes children strange." "The Duke," she stopped, her lips pressing together as though she had already said more than she intended. Eleanor merely nodded, having no desire to encourage gossip that might later entangle her. She had survived worse than a demanding employer and a lonely child. She had survived the destruction of everything she loved. And then, as she stood at her window that evening, watching the last light fade over the gardens below, she saw him. He emerged from the stables astride a midnight black horse, his dark hair windswept, his bearing so commanding that even at this distance she could feel the force of his presence like a physical weight. The Duke of Blackwood sat his mount as though born to it, his broad shoulders squared against the dying day, his profile sharp and aristocratic as he surveyed his domain with the expression of a man who carried burdens he permitted no one else to share. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, an involuntary response that she immediately suppressed with ruthless determination, for she could not afford to notice such things about her employer, could not afford to feel anything at all beyond gratitude for the roof over her head and the anonymity that might keep her alive. The summons came on her 3rd morning at Thornwood, delivered by a footman whose expression suggested he rather pitied her for what was to come, and Eleanor followed him through corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity until they reached a study that smelled of leather and sandalwood and something else she could not name, but which made her pulse quicken with inexplicable awareness. He stood behind a massive desk of polished mahogany, and where she had observed him from a distance as merely commanding, up close Alexander Fairfax, Duke of Blackwood, was something far more unsettling, tall enough that she had to tilt her chin to meet his gaze, broad-shouldered in a way that spoke of riding and physical labor rather than idle aristocratic pursuits. His dark hair swept back from a face that might have been carved from the same grey stone as his manner, all sharp angles and unyielding planes, save for a mouth that hinted, in its fullness, at passions held ruthlessly in check. But it was his eyes that nearly undid her careful composure, grey as storm clouds and twice as turbulent, sweeping over her with an assessment so thorough she felt certain he could see through the modest governess's dress to the desperate noblewoman beneath. "Miss Vance," he said, and even his voice was commanding, deep and rich with an authority that expected obedience without question. "Your references speak highly of your accomplishments, yet I find references to be largely worthless as indicators of true capability." Eleanor kept her hands clasped before her, her spine straight, drawing upon every lesson in deportment her mother had ever instilled, even as her heart hammered against her ribs with the force of a caged bird seeking escape. "I can only assure your grace that I am committed to Lady Charlotte's education and well-being," she replied, pleased that her voice emerged steady despite the tremor in her soul, "and I would ask only for the opportunity to demonstrate my worth through action rather than paper." Something flickered in those grey depths, surprise perhaps, or reluctant approval, but it vanished before she could name it, replaced by cool assessment as he questioned her on languages, mathematics, history, and literature, with the rapid-fire precision of a barrister conducting cross-examination. She answered each query with the knowledge her own expensive education had provided, careful to moderate her responses so as not to reveal too much breeding, yet unable to entirely suppress the quality of mind that had once made her father beam with pride. At last he fell silent, studying her with an intensity that made her want to flee, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some fraction of its frost. "Charlotte requires stability," he said, and there it was, a flash of something raw and wounded crossing his features when he spoke his niece's name, a pain so profound that Eleanor felt her own heart clench in recognition of it. She has known too much loss for one so young, and I will not have her attachment engaged only to be abandoned when the position proves too demanding. Before Eleanor could respond, the study door burst open, and a small whirlwind of dark curls and rumpled pinafore rushed past her to throw herself against the Duke's legs. "Uncle Alexander," Mrs. Hartley said, "the new governess has come. Is this her? She looks kind. Please say she can stay." Lady Charlotte turned eyes the same storm grey as her uncle's upon Eleanor, and in their depths Eleanor saw not a strange or difficult child, but simply a lonely little girl, desperate for someone to love her, and something within her chest that had been frozen since her parents' death began, against all wisdom. To Thor. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Eleanor had scarcely dared hope for, each day bringing new evidence that she had found, if not a home, then at least a harbour where she might shelter from the storms that had ravaged her young life. Charlotte proved to be everything Eleanor could have wished for in a pupil bright and eager, starved for attention and affection, blossoming beneath the steady warmth of Eleanor's patient instruction like a flower too long denied sunlight. They read together in the sunny schoolroom each morning, Eleanor delighting in the child's quick mind and quicker tongue, and in the afternoons they walked the extensive grounds, while Eleanor taught her the names of plants and birds, watched her chase butterflies through meadows thick with wildflowers, listened to her chatter about everything and nothing with the endless energy of childhood. Yet even as Eleanor devoted herself to her charge, she found her attention drawn inexorably to the master of Thornwood, observing him in stolen glances and careful study, as one might observe a magnificent but dangerous creature whose nature one sought to understand. The Duke was a paradox wrapped in expensive tailoring, cold and distant, with nearly everyone yet capable of unexpected gentleness. When he thought himself unobserved, she saw him once, through a window, kneeling in the stable yard to help a young groom whose horse had thrown him, his hands steady and sure as he checked the boy for injury. The servants feared his temper and his exacting standards, yet they also spoke of his fairness, of rents reduced for struggling tenants and cottages repaired without request, of a master who demanded much but gave more. She learned that he rose before dawn to ride his lands, that he spent hours each day attending to correspondence and accounts that lesser men would have delegated, that he ate most meals alone in his study, rather than in the vast echoing dining room designed for entertaining he never did. It was on such a night, nearly a month into her employment, that Eleanor made the mistake that would haunt her with its sweetness and its danger. Unable to sleep, she had crept down to the library in search of something to read, a liberty she had not precisely been granted, but which she justified with the desperation of a mind too active for rest, and she had become so absorbed in a volume of philosophical essays that she failed to hear the door open behind her. "Miss Vance," his voice came from the shadows, and she startled so violently that the book tumbled from her hands. "I had not taken you for a devotee of Locke." She scrambled to retrieve the volume, her cheeks burning with mortification, but when she dared to meet his gaze, she found not anger but something closer to curiosity, and what followed was an hour of conversation such as she had not enjoyed since her father's death, a discussion of ideas and ideals, of reason and passion, of the duties owed by those with power to those without. He challenged her opinions with sharp intelligence, seemed genuinely interested in her responses, and when at last she excused herself with the lateness of the hour serving as flimsy excuse, she saw in his expression a bewilderment that matched her own, as though neither of them quite understood what had just transpired between them in the candlelit darkness of that book-lined sanctuary. After that night in the library, something shifted in the very atmosphere of Thornwood Manor, a change so subtle that Eleanor might have convinced herself she imagined it, were it not for the evidence that accumulated with each passing day, like snow gathering upon winter ground. The Duke began appearing during Charlotte's lessons with a frequency that defied coincidence, settling himself in a chair by the window with papers or correspondence that seemed to require his attention, yet somehow never prevented him from interjecting observations into their discussions of history or mathematics, his grey eyes meeting Eleanor's across the schoolroom with an intensity that made her forget, momentarily, the Latin conjugation she had been explaining. She told herself it was merely a guardian's natural interest in his ward's education, that his presence signified oversight rather than any particular desire for her company, yet such rational explanations grew increasingly difficult to sustain When she noticed how his hand lingered against hers when passing a book across the table, how his gaze followed her movements with an attention that seemed to catalogue every gesture, every expression, every unconscious tuck of hair behind her ear, Mrs. Hartley, ever observant, remarked one afternoon that she had never seen His Grace take such interest in the schoolroom before, and when Eleanor pressed her for information about the Duke's history, the housekeeper's face softened with something like pity as she spoke of his parents' notorious marriage, a union of two great fortunes that had produced nothing but cold silences and bitter recriminations, teaching a young Alexander that love was weakness and marriage merely transaction. He had sworn, Mrs. Hartley confided, never to marry except for practical advantage, yet he had refused every eligible match presented to him for a decade, leaving society to speculate endlessly about what manner of woman might finally capture the elusive Duke of Blackwood. Eleanor absorbed this intelligence with a heart that ached with recognition, for she too had learned harsh lessons about love's dangers, about the cruelty of trusting one's happiness to forces beyond one's control, and she understood, perhaps better than anyone, the fortress of solitude a wounded soul might construct against further hurt. It was Charlotte who unwittingly pierced Eleanor's defenses most deeply, the child crawling into her lap one rainy afternoon and confiding with the devastating honesty of youth that her uncle was terribly sad, but pretended not to be, that she heard him walking the corridors late at night when he thought everyone asleep, that she wished someone would make him smile the way Eleanor made her smile. The words lodged themselves beneath Eleanor's ribs like splinters she could not extract, and that night, lying in her narrow bed listening to the rain against her window, she acknowledged the truth she had been desperately denying, that somewhere between philosophical debates and lingering glances, between a child's laughter and a lonely man's hidden pain, she had begun to feel something for the Duke of Blackwood that went far beyond gratitude or respect, something dangerous and impossible and entirely beyond her power to prevent, and the recognition of it terrified her more than the threat of discovery ever had. The arrival of Lord Reginald Crane shattered the fragile peace Eleanor had constructed around herself like a stone hurled through glass, and from the moment she heard his name announced by the butler, she felt the cold grip of terror close around her throat with suffocating force. She recognized him instantly when he swept into the drawing-room where she sat with Charlotte, that lean, vulpine face, those calculating eyes, the cruel twist of lips that she remembered from her father's trial, where he had sat among the spectators with an expression of barely concealed satisfaction as the verdict was pronounced. He was a distant cousin of the Duke's, she learned from the servants' whispers, one who appeared periodically to curry favor and assess his prospects, should the unmarried Duke meet some untimely end, and his presence at Thornwood sent Eleanor into a desperate campaign of avoidance, pleading headaches and pressing duties to escape any gathering where he might appear. Yet fate, which had already proven itself her enemy, conspired against her when Charlotte begged her uncle to allow Miss Vance to join them at dinner, and the Duke, with a glance at Eleanor that seemed almost pleased, granted the request before she could formulate an excuse. She dressed with trembling hands, choosing her most severe gown, arranging her hair in the plainest style possible, as though she might somehow render herself invisible through sheer dowdiness. But when she entered the dining room and Crane's gaze fell upon her, she watched recognition dawn across his features like a sunrise, revealing a battlefield's carnage. Throughout the interminable meal, she felt his eyes upon her, assessing, calculating, and when he addressed her directly about her background and education, his questions carried barbs that only she could feel, references to families fallen from grace and the desperation of those who must remake themselves to survive. The Duke seemed to notice something amiss, his grey eyes sharpening as they moved between Eleanor and his cousin, but before he could intervene, dinner concluded and Crane cornered her in the corridor as she fled toward the safety of her chambers. "Lady Eleanora Ashworth," he murmured, his voice silk over steel. "How delightfully unexpected to find the traitor's daughter playing nursemaid in my cousin's household. I wonder what Blackwood would say if he knew he harbored such notorious blood under his roof." Eleanor's denial died on her lips as he laughed softly, informing her that he required certain information about the Duke's business affairs, documents and correspondence that might prove useful to interested parties, and in exchange he would keep her secret safe, allow her to continue this pathetic charade of respectability she had constructed. When she refused, her voice steadier than she felt, his expression hardened into something genuinely frightening, and he gave her 1 week to reconsider, suggesting that exposure was merely the gentlest consequence he might arrange for those who defied him, that a woman alone in the world with no protector and no resources might find herself subject to far worse fates than mere dismissal. He left her shaking in the shadowed corridor, the walls of her carefully built sanctuary crumbling around her, and she understood with devastating clarity that the happiness she had begun, against all wisdom, to imagine might be hers was nothing more than another illusion about to be stripped away. The days following Crane's threat passed in a haze of dread for Eleanor, her usual composure fracturing at the edges, despite her desperate efforts to maintain the facade of normalcy that had become her armor against a hostile world. And she found herself starting at shadows, flinching at footsteps, unable to meet the Duke's penetrating gaze for fear he would read the terror written across her features as clearly as words upon a page. It was therefore inevitable that he would notice, for those grey eyes missed nothing, and on the third morning after Crane's ultimatum, he cornered her in the corridor outside the schoolroom with an expression that brooked no evasion, demanding to know what his cousin had said to her that had transformed her from a woman of quiet confidence into this pale, trembling creature who jumped at the sound of her own name. Eleanor deflected with practiced skill, speaking of fatigue and concern for Charlotte's upcoming studies, but the Duke's jaw tightened with frustration even as he chose, to her profound relief, not to press further, merely watching her with an intensity that suggested he was filing away her non-answer for future examination. What happened next defied every expectation she had formed about her precarious situation, for when she descended the following morning, it was to discover the household in a state of barely suppressed excitement, and Lord Crane's carriage being loaded with his belongings in the courtyard below. She positioned herself near the drawing-room doors, invisible as only a servant can be, and witnessed the exchange between the two men. Crane's face mottled with fury as he spoke of family obligations and expected hospitality, his voice carrying veiled references to secrets and consequences that made Eleanor's blood turn to ice, while the Duke stood immovable as granite, his response delivered in tones of such arctic contempt that even Crane, for all his bluster, visibly recoiled. "You will leave my house within the hour," the Duke pronounced, each word falling like a hammer strike upon an anvil, "and you will not return. Not while I draw breath, whatever game you believe yourself to be playing, whatever leverage you imagine you possess. I assure you that you have catastrophically misjudged both your position and my tolerance for those who threaten what is mine." Crane departed in a fury of spinning wheels and scattered gravel, and Eleanor sagged against the wall, weak with a relief she did not fully understand, for surely this was merely a temporary reprieve. Surely Crane would find other means to destroy her, yet when the Duke sought her out an hour later, finding her in the garden where she had fled to compose herself, he did not demand explanations or answers. He simply stood beside her among the roses, his presence solid and warm against the autumn chill, and when he spoke, his voice held none of its usual coldness, but rather something almost tender beneath the formality. "That man will never trouble you again while you are under my protection," he said, and though he asked nothing, explained nothing, expected nothing in return, Eleanor felt something within her chest crack open like ice breaking beneath spring sunshine, and she understood with terrifying clarity that despite every warning she had given herself, despite the impossibility of her situation and the secrets that still lay between them, her heart had already surrendered to this stern, complicated, unexpectedly protective man who had just declared himself her champion without even knowing who she truly was. The rain began on a Tuesday afternoon, a relentless grey curtain that shrouded Thornwood Manor in premature twilight and seemed to seep into the very stones of the ancient house, and it was on this day that Charlotte complained of a headache during her afternoon lessons, her small face flushed and her usually bright eyes dulled with a weariness that sent the first tendrils of alarm curling through Eleanor's chest. By evening, the child was burning with fever, her small body racked with chills that no amount of blankets could warm, and Eleanor sent for the physician while she bathed Charlotte's forehead with cool cloths and murmured soothing nonsense that she hoped might penetrate the haze of illness. The Duke arrived in the sick room like a storm himself, his face pale beneath its usual sternness, and when he saw Charlotte lying so still and small in her bed, Something in his expression cracked open to reveal a devastation so profound that Eleanor felt her own heart clench in sympathy. The physician came and went, pronouncing it a fever that must run its course, prescribing rest and cool compresses and prayers. And then it was just the three of them, Eleanor, the Duke, and the sick child who had become precious to them both, keeping vigil through the endless hours, while rain lashed the windows and the fire crackled low in the grate. They did not speak at first, the silence broken only by Charlotte's restless murmurs and the Duke's pacing footsteps. But as midnight approached and exhaustion wore away the edges of formality, he sank into the chair beside Eleanor's and began, haltingly, to speak of his sister. Her name was Catherine, he said, and she had been Charlotte's mother, and she had died 2 years ago in a carriage accident alongside her worthless husband, but the truth was that she had died long before that, piece by piece, in a marriage that had stripped away everything bright and hopeful about her until she was merely a ghost wearing his sister's face. He blamed himself, his voice rough in the darkness, because he had seen the signs and done nothing, had told himself that it was not his place to interfere, had maintained the cold distance their parents had modeled, and called it propriety when it was really cowardice. Eleanor listened without interruption, understanding instinctively that this confession had been locked inside him for years, poisoning him with guilt and regret. And when he fell silent, his head bowed and his hands clenched upon his knees, she reached out without thinking and laid her fingers over his. He went utterly still at her touch, and when he raised his head, his grey eyes met hers with an expression she had never seen before, raw and vulnerable and searching, and she felt as though he was seeing her truly for the first time, not as a governess or a mystery to be solved, but as a woman, as someone who understood loss and survival, and the weight of secrets carried alone. They remained that way through the darkest hours, hands intertwined, speaking softly of grief and guilt and the fierce protectiveness that Charlotte had awakened in them both. And when dawn finally broke through the rain clouds and Charlotte's fever broke with it, her small voice croaking a request for water, Eleanor wept with relief, while the Duke gathered his niece gently in his arms and pressed his lips to her damp hair. Something had shifted between them in that long night of shared fear and whispered confessions, something that could not be unnamed or ignored. And when Eleanor finally rose to leave the sick room, Alexander caught her hand once more, his thumb tracing across her knuckles with devastating tenderness. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried the weight of everything he could not yet say, and Eleanor understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return, that whatever careful distance had existed between the Duke and his daughter's governess had been dissolved in the intimacy of that vigil, leaving only two souls who had recognized in each other a kindred loneliness, a matching wound, and the terrifying possibility of healing. In the days that followed Charlotte's recovery, Eleanor waged a silent war against her own treacherous heart, marshalling every argument of reason and practicality against the feelings that had taken root within her breast. Like wildflowers pushing through stone, she was a governess, a woman living under a false name, a fugitive from her own history, and he was a duke, one of the most powerful men in England, a man whose very station demanded a wife of impeccable lineage and untarnished reputation, not a disgraced earl's daughter masquerading as a servant. Yet reason proved a feeble weapon against the assault of his presence. For Alexander, she could no longer think of him as merely the Duke, not after that night of shared vigil and whispered confessions had apparently abandoned whatever pretense of distance had previously governed their interactions, seeking her company with an openness that both thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. He began appearing during Charlotte's morning lessons not as a stern overseer but as a participant, his deep voice joining in their reading exercises, his rare laughter ringing out when Charlotte made some clever observation, and always his grey eyes finding Eleanor's across the schoolroom with an intensity that made her forget the words on the page before her. Their walks became a daily ritual, setting out across the grounds of Thornwood in the golden light of autumn afternoons, while Charlotte ran ahead gathering coloured leaves, and they would speak of everything and nothing of philosophy and poetry, of the latest agricultural innovations he was implementing on his estates, of Eleanor's opinions on education and the novels she had been reading from his library. And she found herself sharing thoughts she had kept locked away for years, ideas and arguments that would have been considered shockingly bold from a mere governess, but which he received with evident delight and engaged with, as though her mind were a treasure newly discovered. "You argue like a woman who has studied rhetoric," he observed one afternoon, a note of something that might have been admiration coloring his voice, and Eleanor felt her heart stutter with the familiar fear of discovery, even as warmth spread through her chest at his words. She caught him watching her at odd moments across the dinner table, where she now sat regularly at Charlotte's insistence, in the library where they both happened to seek refuge on rainy evenings, during musicale nights, when she played the pianoforte, and his gaze never left her face. And what she saw in those grey depths was not the cold assessment of an employer, but something far more dangerous, something that mirrored the impossible feelings she struggled daily to suppress. The household noticed, of course, servants always did, and the whispers that followed Eleanor through the corridors grew more frequent, more pointed, until finally Mrs. Hartley drew her aside one evening, the older woman's face creased with genuine concern rather than censure. "Guard your heart, my dear," the housekeeper said softly, pressing Eleanor's hands between her own worn palms. "For whatever his grace may feel, the world will not be kind to such an attachment. I have seen it before, and it never ends well for women in our position." Eleanor thanked her for the warning, her voice steady despite the ache blooming behind her ribs, but as she climbed the stairs to her modest chamber, she acknowledged the bitter truth that Mrs. Hartley's caution had come far too late. Her heart was no longer hers to guard, having surrendered itself completely to a man who could never truly be hers, and she could only wait in helpless anticipation for the inevitable moment when this fragile dream would shatter around her. The announcement came without warning on a crisp October morning, delivered by Alexander himself during Charlotte's geography lesson, with a studied casualness that did not quite mask the tension in his shoulders. Thornwood Manor would host a ball, the first in nearly 5 years, to celebrate Charlotte's recovery and to introduce her properly to the neighboring families whose children might become her companions and friends. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face even as Charlotte squealed with delight, for a ball meant guests, dozens of them, members of the ton who might recognize the face of Lady Eleanora Ashworth beneath the modest cap and careful anonymity of Eleanor Vance, and she opened her mouth to protest, to plead some excuse, but Alexander's grey eyes met hers with an expression that brooked no argument. "You will attend, of course," he said, and it was not a request but a command wrapped in velvet. "Charlotte will need her companion beside her, and I have taken the liberty of ordering a gown appropriate to the occasion. It would displease me greatly if you were to refuse." The gown arrived 3 days before the ball, delivered to Eleanor's modest chamber in a box of such elegant craftsmanship that her hands trembled as she lifted the lid, and what lay within stole her breath entirely. Silk the color of moonlight on water, pale silver blue, that would bring out the depths of her eyes, with delicate embroidery of tiny flowers cascading down the skirt, and a neckline that was modest yet flattering, the work of a master modiste who charged more for a single creation than Eleanor had earned in her entire year of service. She should refuse it, she knew, should insist upon wearing her serviceable grey wool and remaining invisible among the servants. But when she tried on the gown in the privacy of her room and saw the woman reflected in her small mirror, she could not bring herself to return it for just one night. She would allow herself to remember what it felt like to be Lady Eleanora, to move through glittering crowds with her head held high, even knowing the danger such visibility invited. The night of the ball arrived wrapped in the first frost of autumn, and Thornwood blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, music floating through halls that had stood silent for too long, and Eleanor descended the staircase with Charlotte's small hand clasped in hers, acutely aware of the moment when Alexander looked up from his position, greeting guests, and went utterly still, his grey eyes travelling over her with an intensity that sent heat flooding through her veins. They danced. She had not intended to dance, had planned to remain safely at the margins with Charlotte. But he asked, and she could not refuse him, and when his hand settled at her waist and drew her into the first waltz, the rest of the ballroom seemed to dissolve into meaningless colour and sound, leaving only the two of them turning together in perfect synchrony as whispers spread like wildfire through the assembled guests. One dance became 2, then 3, and Eleanor knew she should stop, should remember her place, but the way he looked at her made her reckless, made her forget everything except the warmth of his hand and the rare smile playing at the corners of his stern mouth. And then she saw him, across the crowded ballroom, his cruel face twisted with triumphant recognition, and her blood turned to ice in her veins as Lord Reginald Crane raised his glass to her in mocking salute, and she understood with devastating certainty that her borrowed happiness had just run out of time. The music died as though the musicians themselves had been struck mute, and into that terrible silence came Lord Crane's voice, carrying across the ballroom with the precision of a man who had waited long for this moment of triumph. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe introductions are in order," he announced, his cruel smile stretching wider as he gestured toward Eleanor with theatrical flourish. "For the woman you have been watching dance in the Duke's arms is none other than Lady Eleanora Ashworth, daughter of the traitor Earl of Whitmore, a woman who has been living among you under false pretenses, deceiving your host and endangering his household with her very presence." The gasps that rippled through the assembled guests struck Eleanor like physical blows, and she felt herself swaying. The beautiful silver-blue gown that had made her feel like a princess now marking her as a target for every scandalized eye in the room. She waited for the floor to open and swallow her whole, waited for Alexander to step away from her with the disgust she deserved, waited for the final destruction of every fragile hope she had dared to nurture. But Alexander did not step away. Instead, he stepped forward, positioning himself between Eleanor and the sea of shocked faces, and when he spoke, his voice carried the cold authority of a man who had never in his life been gainsaid. "Lord Crane speaks the truth in one regard," he said, and Eleanor's heart shattered, but then he continued, his words falling like hammer blows upon the assembled company. "The woman beside me is indeed Lady Eleanora Ashworth, and I have known her true identity since the moment she entered my household. What Lord Crane neglects to mention, however, is that the Earl of Whitmore was innocent of all charges leveled against him, framed by a conspiracy of men motivated by greed and political ambition, men whose names I have spent these past months uncovering with the assistance of the Crown's own investigators." The silence that followed was of an entirely different quality than before, charged now with shock and dawning comprehension, and Eleanor watched as Crane's triumphant expression crumbled into something approaching fear. "You lie," Crane sputtered, but his voice had lost its confident ring, and he took an involuntary step backward as Alexander advanced upon him, grey eyes blazing with righteous fury. "I have documents," Alexander continued, his voice rising to reach every corner of the ballroom. "Letters, financial records, testimony from witnesses who were coerced into silence, evidence sufficient to prove not only Lord Whitmore's innocence, but the guilt of those who orchestrated his destruction, including several of your closest associates, Crane, and your own complicity in the affair." The doors to the ballroom opened and uniformed men entered, their presence commanding immediate attention, and Eleanor watched in stunned disbelief as Crane was seized, his protests growing increasingly desperate as he was led away, his threats and accusations dissolving into the impotent ravings of a man who had finally been called to account for his sins. Eleanor stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just transpired, unable to reconcile the nightmare she had anticipated with the extraordinary reality unfolding before her, and when Alexander turned back to face her, his expression softening from cold fury to something infinitely more tender, she found that words had abandoned her entirely, leaving only questions that trembled on her lips and tears that spilled unchecked down her pale cheeks. The ballroom remained frozen in tableau, guests suspended between scandal and revelation, and Eleanor could scarcely breathe as Alexander continued speaking, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, even as his grey eyes remained fixed upon her face with an expression she could not name. "I recognized Lady Eleanora the moment she crossed Thornwood's threshold," he said, and the confession struck her like a physical blow, for I had seen her once before, 3 years past, at her debut season, a radiant young woman dancing in her father's arms, so full of joy and promise that the image burned itself into my memory, though we were never formally introduced, and she would have no reason to remember a stern duke who watched from the shadows of the ballroom. Eleanor's mind reeled backward through time, grasping at fragments of that glittering night before tragedy had shattered her world, but she could not conjure his face from among the blur of guests who had attended her coming-out ball. She had been too dazzled by the newness of it all, too innocent to notice the dark-haired nobleman whose gaze had apparently followed her across a crowded room. When she arrived at my door seeking employment, Alexander continued, addressing the assembled company, though his words seemed meant for her alone. "I saw what she had become, a woman stripped of everything, yet possessing a dignity and strength that her circumstances could not diminish, and I knew I could not turn her away, could not let her disappear into the anonymous ranks of servants when she deserved so much more. He spoke then of investigators hired within a fortnight of her arrival, of months spent tracing the conspiracy that had destroyed her father, of evidence painstakingly gathered from reluctant witnesses and hidden correspondence, of letters sent to the Crown itself, presenting an unassailable case for the Earl of Whitmore's posthumous exoneration. "I did not tell her," he said, his voice softening, "because I wanted her to be free, free of fear, free of the weight of fighting for vindication while struggling merely to survive, free to simply live while I ensured that justice would be served." Crane, still restrained by the uniformed men, let loose a stream of invective, accusations that Alexander had fabricated evidence, had been seduced by a traitor's daughter into betraying his own class. But his words fell upon deaf ears as the guests began to murmur among themselves, the tide of opinion shifting with the mercurial swiftness that characterized society's judgments. Eleanor felt the walls of the ballroom closing in upon her, the weight of revelation pressing down upon her chest until she could not draw breath, and without conscious thought she turned and fled, pushing through the crowd that parted before her like waves before a ship's prow, desperate for air and solitude and space to comprehend the magnitude of what Alexander had done for her. The garden received her into its cool darkness, frost-touched roses gleaming silver in the moonlight, and she stumbled along the gravel path until her trembling legs would carry her no further, sinking onto a stone bench as sobs tore from her throat, and even as she wept, she heard his footsteps behind her, steady and sure, following her into the night, as he had apparently followed the thread of her tragedy for months, determined to weave it into something new. Why? The word tore from Eleanor's throat as she rose from the stone bench, turning to face him with eyes that blazed through her tears, and she found that the overwhelming gratitude warring with confusion had transformed into something fiercer, a desperate need to understand that overrode every lesson in decorum she had ever learned. "Why would you do this, any of this for me? A woman who came into your household under false pretenses, who lied to you from the moment we met, who could have brought scandal crashing down upon everything you have built." Alexander stood before her in the moonlight, and for the first time since she had known him, he appeared uncertain, the commanding duke who had just faced down a ballroom full of society's elite, now struggling to find words as though they were foreign objects he had never learned to wield. "I could have dismissed you," he said slowly, his voice rough in a way she had never heard. "When I realized who you were, that would have been the prudent course, the safe course, the course that any sensible man would have taken to protect himself and his household from association with scandal." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the rapid pulse at his throat, could smell the familiar scent of sandalwood and something uniquely him that had haunted her dreams for months. "But I found that I could not," he continued, and the confession seemed to cost him something, each word drawn forth with visible effort, "could not bear the thought of you disappearing into the world alone, unprotected, carrying the weight of your father's false disgrace, while the true villains walked free. And I told myself it was justice I sought, merely justice for an innocent man's memory, nothing more." Eleanor watched as he struggled, this powerful man who commanded rooms with a glance, who made lesser men tremble with a word, and she saw the walls he had built around himself cracking, crumbling, falling away to reveal the vulnerable heart beneath. "I am not skilled at this," he said, and there was something almost like desperation in his grey eyes now. Speaking of feelings, at giving voice to the things that move within me, my parents' marriage taught me that love was weakness, that attachment brought only pain, and I armored myself against it so thoroughly that I believed myself impervious." He reached out as though to touch her face, then let his hand fall, as though uncertain of his welcome after all the secrets he had kept. "But you," he breathed, "you undid every defense I had constructed, not through design or artifice, but simply by being who you are, your courage in the face of tragedy, your kindness to a lonely child, your brilliant mind that challenged me, your dignity that never wavered no matter how reduced your circumstances." His voice broke on the final words, and Eleanor felt her own heart breaking open in response, all her careful guards swept away by the raw honesty in his confession. "I love you," he said, and the words hung in the frost-touched air like sacred things. Not Lady Eleanora, not Eleanor the governess, but simply you, the woman who reads philosophy in my library at midnight, who makes my niece laugh, who debates me over breakfast, and never lets me win simply because of my title, and I ask nothing of you in return, but your forgiveness for keeping my knowledge secret, for letting you believe yourself alone when I was fighting for you all along." Eleanor stood trembling in the moonlit garden, his confession echoing through her mind like the pealing of distant bells, and she knew that the moment had come to lay down the last of her defenses, to speak the truth that had burned within her breast for months, though she had believed it must remain forever unspoken. "I have loved you," she whispered, and the words emerged broken, halting, torn from some deep place within her that had long ago learned to expect nothing, to hope for nothing, to protect itself behind walls of practicality and resignation, against every dictate of wisdom, against all reason, against the certain knowledge that a governess could never aspire to a duke's heart. "I have loved you since the night we sat together in the library, and you spoke to me as though my thoughts mattered, since the morning Charlotte's fever broke, and I saw the tenderness you hide beneath your stern exterior, since 1,000 small moments that accumulated into something so vast I could not contain it." Her voice cracked on the final words, and she found that tears were streaming down her cheeks, washing away the last vestiges of the composed mask she had worn for 3 long years, leaving only the woman beneath wounded, wanting, desperately hoping that this was real and not some fever dream from which she would wake to find herself alone once more. Alexander closed the distance between them in a single stride, his hands capturing hers with a grip that trembled slightly, this powerful man who commanded armies of servants and vast estates, now shaking like a boy at her simple confession, and when he spoke his voice was rough with an emotion that matched her own. "Then be my wife," he said, and the words were not a command from a duke to a subordinate, but a plea from a man to the woman he loved. Not for duty, not for alliance, not for any practical consideration that society might deem appropriate, "Be my wife, because I cannot imagine drawing breath in a world where you are not beside me, because the thought of waking without you near drives me to something approaching madness, because a life without your voice, your laughter, your fierce intelligence, your tender heart would be no life at all but merely existence, and I have existed long enough." Eleanor could not speak, could not find words adequate to the enormity of the moment, but she found she did not need them, as she whispered, "Yes," a single syllable that carried the weight of all her hopes and dreams and desperate longings, and then his mouth was upon hers, and thought dissolved into pure sensation. He kissed her tenderly at first, reverently, as though she was something precious and breakable, but she was not breakable. She had survived the destruction of her entire world and emerged unbroken, and she pulled him closer, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, and the kiss transformed into something fierce and hungry, years of loneliness pouring forth from both of them, 2 souls who had wandered in darkness, finally finding their way home to each other. Above them the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, indifferent to the affairs of mortals. Yet Eleanor could have sworn they shone brighter in that moment, bearing witness as 2 broken people discovered that their jagged edges fit together perfectly, that the wounds they carried could become the very places where healing began. The wedding was a quiet affair, intimate by design rather than necessity, for half of London society would have clamoured for invitations had they been offered, but Alexander had looked at her with those grey eyes that now held warmth instead of frost, and asked what she wanted, and she had wanted only him, only the truth of their union, without the spectacle of society's observation. And so they were married in the small chapel at Thornwood, with Charlotte as flower girl, and Missus, Hartley weeping happy tears, and the autumn sunlight streaming through ancient stained glass, to paint them both in colours of gold and rose. That evening, as the last of the modest celebration faded and the household retired to give the newlyweds privacy, Eleanor found herself standing in the Duchess's chambers, her chambers now trembling with a combination of anticipation and nervousness that she could not quite suppress. For, despite everything they had shared, despite the confessions and the kisses that had grown increasingly urgent in the days since his proposal, this was uncharted territory, a realm of intimacy she had never imagined she would enter with a man she loved so completely. The door opened behind her, and she turned to find Alexander. Her husband, how strange and wonderful those words felt, watching her with an expression that stole her breath, tenderness and desire, mingled together in a way that made her feel simultaneously cherished and wanted, two sensations she had long ago stopped believing she would ever experience. He crossed to her slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wished, but retreat was the furthest thing from her mind, as he reached up to cup her face in hands that had wielded power over vast estates, yet now trembled slightly against her skin. "I have imagined this," he murmured, his voice rough, "more times than I should confess, dreamed of you in my arms, in my bed, and yet the reality of you here exceeds every fantasy. You are so beautiful, Eleanor, so impossibly beautiful, and I find myself terrified that I will wake to discover this was merely another dream from which morning would steal you away." She answered him not with words but with action, rising on her toes to press her lips to his, and the kiss ignited something that had been building between them for months, a conflagration of longing too long denied. And when he lifted her in his arms and carried her to the bed, she went willingly, joyfully, surrendering to the passion she had fought against for so long. He was tender and reverent as he undressed her, pressing kisses to each inch of skin revealed, as though memorizing her with his lips, and she discovered that the stern, cold duke she had first met had hidden depths of gentleness that undid her completely, that his touch could be simultaneously worshipful and consuming, that he could make her feel precious beyond measure, even as he drove her to heights of pleasure she had never known existed. Afterward, wrapped in his arms with her head upon his chest and his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, she wept not from sorrow but from a joy so overwhelming her body could not contain it, and he held her through the storm of emotion, stroking her hair, pressing kisses to her crown, whispering promises of forever against her skin. "I love you," she breathed when she could speak again, and the words felt inadequate to encompass the enormity of what she felt, but he smiled against her hair and pulled her closer, and she knew that he understood, that words would never be sufficient between them, because their love had been built on actions, on choices, on the thousand small moments that had led them inexorably to this perfect union. And she finally allowed herself to believe that she was worthy of happiness, that this love was real and lasting, that she had found her home, not in a place but in a person, and that home would shelter her for the rest of her days. The letter from the crown arrived on a grey morning 3 weeks after their wedding, its seal bearing the weight of kingdoms and the power to reshape lives, and Eleanor's hands trembled as Alexander read aloud the words that restored everything she had lost. Her father's name cleared of all charges, his honour restored posthumously, the title of Earl of Whitmore acknowledged as rightfully belonging to her family line, and a portion of the seized estates returned to her possession as the sole surviving heir. She wept then, not for the lands or the title, but for her father, who had died in a cold prison cell, believing himself abandoned by the world he had served faithfully, for her mother who had withered away from grief and shame, for the girl she had been, who had lost everything in a single devastating season, and Alexander held her through the storm of emotion as he had held her through so many storms, his steady presence an anchor in the tempest of feeling that threatened to overwhelm her. The ton, that fickle arbiter of worth and reputation, turned with dizzying speed from censure to adoration, and their first public appearance as the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood became a spectacle of society's eagerness to align itself with vindicated virtue and ducal power. Ladies who had once cut Eleanor dead now pressed forward with simpering compliments. Gentlemen who had whispered of Traitor's blood now praised her grace and beauty, and she navigated the treacherous waters of their hypocrisy with a composure that made Alexander's grey eyes glow with fierce pride, his hand never leaving the small of her back, his presence a silent declaration that she was his and he would suffer no slight against her. It was in the midst of this glittering assembly that Eleanor encountered Lady Crane, the woman who had married Lord Reginald for his fortune and found herself shackled to a man now disgraced, stripped of position, facing exile if not imprisonment for his role in the conspiracy against her father. Lady Crane's face was thin and bitter, her eyes hollow with the particular misery of one who had traded her soul for security and discovered too late that she had purchased only gilded suffering, and as their gazes met across the crowded ballroom, Eleanor felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only a profound pity for a woman who had never known what it meant to be loved, as she was loved completely, fiercely, unconditionally. "You are more gracious than she deserves," Alexander murmured against her ear as they watched Lady Crane retreat into the shadows, and Eleanor turned to look up at her husband, this man who had moved heaven and earth to restore her honour, who had seen through her disguise to the truth beneath and loved her not despite her brokenness but perhaps in part because of it. "I have everything," she replied softly, her fingers intertwining with his, "and she has nothing that matters. How could I feel anything but compassion for such poverty of spirit?" He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that promised later tenderness, and she knew that this was her true vindication, not the restoration of title or lands, not the fawning attention of society, but this moment, this man, this love that had grown from the ashes of her former life into something more beautiful than anything she had lost. The months that followed, their vindication flowed like honey, golden and sweet, each day bringing new evidence that Eleanor's life had transformed beyond anything her desperate younger self could have imagined as she fled London with nothing but a borrowed name and a broken heart. Thornwood Manor, which had once struck her as beautiful but cold, a monument to grandeur without warmth, became under her careful attention a home in the truest sense. She filled its echoing halls with flowers from the gardens she had begun to cultivate, with the sound of Charlotte's laughter ringing through corridors that had known too much silence, with the warmth of fires that burned not merely for heat, but for the comfort of gathering together in the evenings when Alexander would read aloud while she embroidered and Charlotte practiced her sketching. The servants, who had once moved through the house with the wary efficiency of those who feared displeasure, now smiled freely, and Mrs. Hartley confided one afternoon over tea that she had never seen the household so happy, that the Duke was a changed man, that love had accomplished what duty never could. Charlotte flourished most remarkably of all. The lonely, grieving child Eleanor had first met, transformed into a bright and confident girl who called her Aunt Eleanor with obvious delight, and who no longer flinched at sudden sounds or retreated into silence when strangers visited. Her security in being loved, having healed wounds that Eleanor understood intimately, for she too had learned that the right love could mend what seemed irreparably broken. Eleanor threw herself into purposes beyond the domestic sphere as well, establishing a small school for the tenant children where she taught reading and writing and basic arithmetic, finding profound satisfaction in opening doors of possibility for those whom society had deemed unworthy of education, and Alexander supported every endeavor with resources and genuine interest, often visiting the school himself, to the children's initial terror and eventual adoration. Their evenings became a cherished ritual debates over breakfast about political philosophy, discussions of literature that sometimes grew heated enough to require resolution in more pleasant ways, long walks through the estate, where Alexander showed her every corner of the lands he had always loved, but never before had anyone with whom to share them, and nights of passion that only deepened as they learned each other's bodies and hearts with increasing intimacy. It was on such a night, the spring air fragrant through their open window, that Eleanor first suspected what the physician would later confirm, and when she told Alexander that she carried his child, he wept. The stern, cold Duke of Blackwood, the manservants had once feared to approach, the man who had sworn never to marry for anything but practical alliance, stood before her with tears streaming unashamedly down his face, his hands trembling as they cradled her still flat stomach, his voice breaking as he told her that she had given him everything, everything he had never dared to want, and she held him as he held her, two souls who had found in each other the home they had each believed forever lost. 3 years had passed since the night Eleanor had told Alexander of the child growing within her, 3 years that had transformed Thornwood Manor from a place of quiet grandeur into a home alive with the sounds she had once believed she would never hear: the patter of small feet racing down corridors, the shrieking laughter of children at play, the particular music of a family thriving in the fullness of love. On this particular afternoon, golden with the warmth of late summer, Eleanor sat upon a blanket spread across the manicured lawn, her infant daughter Margaret cradled against her breast, the baby's tiny fingers wrapped around one of her own as she nursed contentedly, and Eleanor watched with a heart so full it seemed impossible it could contain such joy as Alexander chased their 2-year-old son William across the grass. The boy ran with the unsteady determination of toddlers everywhere, his dark hair so like his father's catching the sunlight, his grey eyes also his father's gift, bright with delight as he shrieked and dodged, and Alexander pursued with an exaggerated slowness that fooled no one, his face transformed by a grin that those who had known the cold Duke of Blackwood 3 years prior would scarcely have recognized. Charlotte, now 11 and growing into a remarkable young woman, sat beneath the sprawling apple tree at the garden's edge, with a book in her lap, though her eyes lifted frequently from the pages to watch her uncle and cousin with an expression of contented amusement. Her own journey from lonely, grieving child to secure and happy girl, a testament to the healing power of being truly loved. Eleanor found herself doing what she often did in quiet moments such as these, tracing the improbable path that had led her here, from the daughter of an earl to a fugitive with nothing, from a governess hiding in plain sight to the Duchess of Blackwood, wife to a man who loved her with a devotion that still stole her breath, mother to children she had never dared dream of having. She thought of the girl she had been at 19, standing in the ashes of her life with nothing but a borrowed name and a determination to survive, and she marveled that that desperate young woman could never have imagined this abundance of love, this wealth of purpose, this bone-deep contentment that suffused her days. Alexander caught William at last, swinging the squealing boy up into his arms and settling him on his shoulders, and as he turned to walk back toward Eleanor, their eyes met across the sun-drenched garden, and the smile he gave her was the same smile he had given her on their wedding night in the moonlit garden when he had first confessed his love, in 1,000 moments between a smile that said without words that she was his heart, his home, his everything. William babbled happily from his perch, one small hand tangled in his father's hair, and Margaret stirred and sighed against Eleanor's breast, and Charlotte called out something teasing about her uncle finally catching his prey, and Eleanor thought that if she could speak to that frightened girl she had been, she would tell her that the worst tragedy of her life would lead her to the greatest happiness she could imagine, that the path through darkness was leading somewhere luminous beyond all reckoning. The garden party, celebrating their 3rd anniversary, transformed Thornwood's grounds into a vision from a dream, with lanterns strung between the ancient oaks, casting warm pools of light across tables laden with delicacies, with flowers from Eleanor's own gardens arranged in cascading abundance, with music floating from the quartet stationed near the Rose Arbor, where she and Alexander had exchanged their vows in a private ceremony 3 years before. The guests who filled the grounds represented the life they had built together, neighbors who had become genuine friends, tenants who had prospered under Alexander's fair management and Eleanor's educational initiatives, members of society who had proven their loyalty through constancy rather than convenience, and most importantly, those who had believed in them when believing required courage. Mrs. Hartley presided over the staff with proud efficiency, occasionally dabbing at her eyes when she thought no one was looking, and Charlotte moved through the gathering with the poise of a young lady, helping to entertain the younger guests while keeping a watchful eye on William, who had discovered that the hedgerows made excellent hiding places. Eleanor stood beside her husband as the evening deepened, Margaret drowsy in her arms, and when Alexander called for the attention of their guests, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering with the commanding resonance she had once found so intimidating, she felt her heart quicken as it had quickened that first day in his study, when his grey eyes had seemed to see straight through her disguise to the truth beneath. He spoke of anniversaries, of the passage of time, of the conventional wisdom that marriages settled into comfortable routine, and then his voice grew rougher, less practiced, as he departed from convention entirely and spoke of her, of the woman who had arrived at Thornwood with nothing but a borrowed name and a dignity that circumstances could not diminish, of the governess who had taught his ward to smile again, and taught him, though he had not known he needed teaching, that love was not the weakness his parents' bitter union had led him to believe, but rather the greatest strength a heart could possess. He thanked her for their children, for the laughter that filled halls once silent, for the warmth that had transformed a house into a home, for every debate and every kiss, and every moment of a life richer than he had dared to imagine when he had spent his years building walls against precisely the vulnerability that now constituted his greatest joy. The guests had grown very quiet, many of the ladies reaching for handkerchiefs, and Eleanor found that her own eyes had blurred with tears as she looked at this man who had once seemed carved from ice and now stood before their gathered friends with his heart laid bare. This man who had believed her innocent when the world condemned her, who had fought for her vindication while asking nothing in return, who loved her with a devotion that revealed itself not in grand gestures, but in the steady accumulation of 1,000 small moments across 1,000 ordinary days. She rose on her toes to kiss him then, propriety forgotten, Margaret stirring between them and Alexander's arms coming around them both, and the guests erupted in cheers that scattered birds from the nearby trees. And later that night, when the lanterns had been extinguished and the guests had departed and the children slept in their nursery under the watchful eye of the nurse, they lay together in the darkness of their chamber and spoke of the future that stretched before them, more children perhaps, certainly more years, the prospect of growing old together in this house that had become so thoroughly their own, of watching William and Margaret and any siblings who might follow grow into the people they were meant to be, of loving each other through whatever seasons awaited, their bond deepening with each passing year, as roots grow deeper the longer a tree stands. And so we come to the end of this tale, though in truth it is not an ending at all but rather a continuation. For Eleanor and Alexander's story flows onward still, written in the laughter of their children and the quiet moments they share when the house has fallen silent, and they sit together before the fire, her head upon his shoulder, his hand tracing absent patterns on her arm, the comfortable intimacy of a love that has only deepened with the passage of years. If Eleanor could speak to that frightened girl, she had been the one who stood in the ruins of her life at 19, with nothing but a borrowed name and a desperate determination to survive, she would tell her that the path through darkness, though it seemed endless then, was leading somewhere she could not yet imagine, that every step taken in despair was carrying her toward a joy beyond anything she had dared to dream. She would tell her that love finds us when we least expect it, often wearing a face we do not immediately recognize, stern where we might have wished for smiling, silent where we might have craved sweet words, and that actions speak the truth of the heart more eloquently than any poetry ever could. She would tell her that the cruelest chapters of our stories need not define their endings, that we are not the worst things that happen to us, but rather the way we carry ourselves through them with dignity and grace, and the quiet courage to keep hoping even when hope seems foolish. She would tell her to hold on, to trust, to believe with a faith that defies all evidence that happiness was coming for her, was even then making its way toward her through circumstances too intricate to comprehend, and that one day she would look back on her darkest moments and see them not as endings, but as the unlikely beginnings of everything beautiful her life would become. This story has been, in its way, a love letter to the belief that even the most wounded hearts can heal, that even the coldest exteriors can shelter the warmest souls, that marriages built on mutual respect and genuine affection can transform two incomplete people into something whole and radiant together. Thank you, dear listener, for walking this path alongside Eleanor and Alexander, for believing in their love even when they themselves struggled to believe, for investing your heart in their journey toward one another. It is my deepest hope that their story has kindled something within you, a renewed faith in love's possibility, a reminder that your own happiness may be nearer than you know, waiting just beyond the next chapter of your life to surprise you with its sweetness. May you find, or may you already have found, your own great love, the one who sees you truly, who stands beside you against all adversity, who proves their devotion not in grand declarations, but in the steady, sustaining choices of every ordinary day. May your own story, whatever shadows it has passed through, lead you toward light and laughter, and a love that grows ever deeper with the passing of years. And may you always remember that the darkest nights give way to dawn, that hope is never foolish, and that somewhere, somehow, your own happily ever after awaits.